Hello, I'm D.L. Hudson. It's great to be with you again and remind you I don't call myself a Flannery O'Connor scholar. I'm just a dedicated reader like the rest of you who's taken the time to look into the life of Flannery, her influences such as Jacques Maritain, who I spoke to you about not so long ago, and the importance of O'Connor as specifically a Catholic writer is something that really has impacted me and thousands, perhaps millions of other people. Today I'm going to be talking about the short story Greenleaf, which she published in the Kenyon Review in 1956 and was not republished until after her death in the short story collection Everything Rises Must Converge in 1965. So here we go. I call this erotic redemption in O'Connor's Greenleaf. Mrs. May, as we know, is an arrogant woman. She looks down on everyone around her, especially Mr. Greenleaf, who has worked for her for 15 years, and even more on his wife, who is a prayer healer. Mrs. May respects religion. She talks about prayer. She talks about Jesus. She talks about going to church, or her boys can meet a nice girl, but she doesn't believe any of it. She reacts to Mrs. Greenleaf's prayer shouts by thinking, Jesus should be kept inside, and Jesus would be ashamed of you. Mrs. May compares her two boys, to those of Mr. and Mrs. Greenleaf's two boys, trying to disparage their accomplishments versus her sons, the insurance salesman, and the intellectual who is a college professor at a second-rate college. While her sons sometimes speak well of Mrs. Greenleaf, in fact, when in the story they speak well of her, Mrs. May goes the next day to her lawyers and changes her will. So just in case they marry trash, like Mrs. Greenleaf, the trash will not inherit her farm. She tells them, you'll find out what reality is, without realizing that finding out what reality really is her own destiny. She claims to be the only adult on their farm. Mrs. May is control central. But the story opens with can only be described as a mystical scene that threatens to destroy her control over her farm, over her boys, over all the Greenleafs. Perhaps it is better to say that the scene threatens to destroy her illusion of control and all her pretensions that go with it. To understand this story, we have to avoid being influenced by our image of the author, Flannery O'Connor, as modest, unmarried, and well-mannered Southern lady who is devoted and practicing Roman Catholic. A writer we see in photographs sitting on the screen porch of Andalusia with her aged mother. If we don't ignore that image, which I think we all share, we will fail to notice and appreciate the spiritual power of the opening and closing pages of this short story. In this scene, Mrs. May is awakened from her sleep by the sound of something coming through the wall of her bedroom. When she looks out her window, she sees the figure of a bull. The author describes the bull as, quote, like some patient god come down to woo her. Remember that. To me, this is a bull straight out of Greek mythology and represents nothing less than divine force, power, with the ability to crush her and her imagined world. You may recall, if you studied Greek mythology, that Anatolians were honored the bull as a cosmic power, son of the mother goddess, and the bull's horns were the pillars which held up the world. Mesopotamians regarded the bull as a god. It was commonly depicted with a crown on its head. Zeus himself was portrayed with two horns emerging from his head, a symbolism of his powerful divinity. And the Mithratic cult, they followed Mithra, sought power by being showered in the blood of a bull slaughtered from above their heads. This god, this bull with two horns, has already visited Mrs. May in her dreams with its, quote, steady rhythmic chewing, and was eating the house in her dreams, eating everything with, quote, a steady rhythm. He eats all but the green leaves, where the bull at her window comes. When the eating reached her elbow in her dream, she wakes up, jumps to the middle of the room, and hears the bull chewing calmly like an uncouth country suitor. The author underscores this divinity by placing a garland on the horns of the intrusive bull, as she also describes how the garland begins to slip down the horns, quote, as if to show the wreath across his horns, like a menacing, prickly crown. Mrs. May, on the contrary, is a paltry, fragile figure with, quote, narrow shoulders, peering from her window in a, quote, green rubber curlers through the blinds as she has pulled them shut to hide. She's lucky to have a wall between her and the bull from which she hides. In fact, all of her demands to have the bull captured and penned or to have the bull killed are laughable in retrospect. She assumes control, but has none, and refuses to recognize her impotence until the bull has had the last say. She worries the bull will hurt her breeding schedule. Animal mating, she thinks, can be controlled like everything else in her life, and she intends to do it. The sexual desire of this particular scrub bull can be controlled, or so she thinks. It is not lost on the reader that while Mrs. May looks down on everyone, respects no one, she herself receives no respect or love from anyone, not even her sons. Mrs. May talks only about herself, her superiority, her work, her ownership, and all that she has done for everyone in her life, including the boys next door, who have surpassed her own boys in worldly success. Her sense of superiority is challenged one time in the middle of the story by her entrance into the milking parlor of the Greenleaf sons that dazzled her with its brightness and cleanliness. Mrs. May, who is so alive to cleanliness, finds herself out-cleaned. She especially is aggravated that it was done by the Greenleaf boys. On top of that, she has found out that the challenge of the bull garlanded at her window, has come from the Greenleaf boys too, from the people she considers so inferior, the people who she thinks owe everything to her. How could there be anything belonging to the Greenleafs that threatened her control, her status, her self-proclaimed superiority? The author, we find out, is preparing Mrs. May and the reader for a graphic spiritual encounter. This is an encounter which will be in no way intellectual, no way psychological, no way sociological, no way in any manner of rational argument. Not about words at all. It is nothing less than a rape an erotic plunging of the bull's horns into her stomach, or should I say, into her lap. She tells Mr. Greenleaf, quote, "A gentleman is waiting," as she lets him out of the car with his rifle to go find the bull and kill him. The gentleman, it turns out, is waiting for her to arrive. There's a laugh line prior to this moment when she recalls saying to Mr. Greenleaf about his wife, everything in moderation, you know. But she dozes off while leaning back on the hood of her car. More than 10 minutes. She's made herself vulnerable, wondering at her tiredness, but pats herself on the back by attributing this to 15 years of hard work. She passes the time in waiting, thinking of all that she has accomplished in her life. But the author wants no sympathy from Mrs. May. While waiting, she thinks the bull, quote, had turned on him, Mr. Greenleaf, and run him up against a tree and gored him. She'd be sued, she thinks, by a, quote, shyster lawyer hired by his two sons. Even worse, she takes, quote, pleasure in thinking she could tell that story of the bull and the death of Mr. Greenleaf to her friends. But as I have said, Mrs. Greenleaf is control central. She concludes, quote, he had a gun and he had insurance. She imagines herself before a judgment seat, being able to say, quote, I have worked, I have not wallowed. But the bull, we find out, has no time for that. He's made up his mind. In her impatience, she honks the car horn, not realizing it's really an SOS she should be sending. In a few minutes, quote, something emerged from the tree line. It was, as we have been told, the third day the bull had been on Mrs. May's farm. She who has claimed aloud, I'll die when I get good and ready, finds there is no wall this time between herself and the once garlanded country suitor. The bull has found his object of desire. In fact, he is, quote, overjoyed to find her again. Quote, he was crossing the pasture towards her at a slow gallop, a gait, almost rocking gait, as if he was overjoyed to find her again. In other words, he's coming to the dance. She does not move. She, quote, remained perfectly still, not in fright, but in freezing unbelief. Mrs. May was in no way prepared to comprehend that she was about to lose control of her life. Quote, she had no sense of distance, as if she could not decide at once what his intention was. The bull aims for her sexual organs, her lap, not her stomach, quote, like a wild, tormented lover. One horn pierced her heart. One might say her hardened heart. Staring straight ahead, quote, the entire scene in front of her had changed. The tree line was a dark wound in a world that had nothing but sky. And quote, and she had the look of a person whose sight has suddenly been restored, but who finds the light unbearable. It's a light she had never seen before, completely unfamiliar, a light made possible by the horrific wounding by the bull. The dark wound and the unbearable light are the same. She feels, quote, the quake of the bull's body, and the act is complete. This is either O'Connor's form of a liebestod, a love death, or a kind of spousal union described by the great female saints such as St. Hildegard of Bingen, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Catherine of Siena. Her sight is restored, And like a sensitive, tender lover, she whispers in the bull's ear. Quote, she seemed to be bent over whispering some last discovery into the animal's ear. What did she whisper? What was her last discovery? We can only guess. The author does not tell us. It remains their secretive post-coital bed talk. But from the gesture itself, the bending over, the whispering in his ear, we must imagine they were words of love. Erotic redemption is the only way I can describe this moment. One example of how, quote, the violent bear it away. It's the only way a person like Mrs. May could see the light, to understand reality as it is, to comprehend a last discovery. In conclusion, let me read from the Book of Life by St. Teresa of Avila, who died in 1582 and was canonized in 1622. She writes, I saw in his hands a large golden dart, and at the end of the iron tip there appeared to be a little fire. It seemed to me this angel plunged the dart several times into my heart, and that it reached deep within me. When he drew it out, I thought he was carrying me off with him, the deepest part of me, and he left me all on fire with the great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and the sweetness this pain caused me was so superabundant that there is no desire capable of taking it away, nor is the soul content with less than God. The pain is not bodily, but spiritual, although the body doesn't fail to share in some of it, and even a great deal. The loving exchange that takes place between the soul and God is so sweet that I beg him in his goodness to give a taste of this love to anyone who thinks I am lying. That's from her Book of Life, St. Teresa of Avila. I look forward to talking with this about you in just a few minutes. Thank you.